incredible amount of detail and where they wound up. And, and so for me, it was, I knew a lot about, I think, textbook constitution, but not how things kind of related to her and her sister ships, and kind of the struggles that the Navy had, in forming and norming and becoming the force that it was, as there was quite a gap from the end of the Revolutionary War to when the Navy, I guess, was recommissioned, for lack of a better term, which is why you'll hear our Coast Guard brethren always saying the longest, oldest continuous sea service, I think, is the line they use. Yeah. So that gap is where they kind of play that game, although they are a consortium of several different bodies of government that have come together, kind of like companies that get acquired and divested. The Coast Guard is similar. But at any rate, so we talk about the ship a little bit and its construction in Boston, which is pretty cool because, as a lot of people know, my bias towards the city is pretty solid in all things, growing up in that town. She still survives and is probably the more famed of all of them, of all the sister ships that they had. Each meeting, I guess, some sad endings, some premature endings, but the Constitution, she still lives on. When you think of the ship yourself, Captain, what are the kind of the highlights of the career of this ship that that you reflect upon or love to tell the stories about what she's done in her past?
So there's a few. I mean, one of the things I generally talk about is her launching.
Mm-hmm.
She was built in Boston, as you mentioned, right actually where the current Coast Guard station is in the North End. Now it used to be the Edmund C. Hart Shipyard. And when they were building her, they had her on the ways, but they didn't have the angle right exactly. So on her first launching day, when they were trying to send her in the water, the ship went, maybe a third of the way down and got stuck.
Oh,
it didn't make it into the water. So they had to try again. They increased the angle a little bit, tried again, and got a little farther, but didn't make it into the water. So it wasn't until October 21st of 1797 that she was finally put into the Boston Harbor, and that today is considered her birthday. But that whole, the thing I like talking about it is that in our growing economy and trying to figure things out. I mean, it's not that we didn't know how to build ships, but this ship was huge. I mean, for the time, this was the biggest class of frigate on the planet. So trying to get things exactly right, there was some trial and error. And it took them a little bit to get her quite right, and, frankly, the time, care, and effort they put into her, in spite of challenges like getting her to float, are all proven. And that's why it's part of the reason she's here today, because they were so careful and innovative with their design. But working your way through her history, the War of 1812 is where she made her name, and she had several interesting things happen to her there. The most notable was where she was her fight versus the HMS Guerriere on August 19th of 1812, and it was the result of that battle that she got the nickname Old Ironsides. And, that moniker is obviously stuck throughout time. So I like to talk about that story and, how that all came to pass. And as a matter of fact, if you visit the ship today, it's one of the highlight parts of a visit to the ship is one of the sailors will tell every visitor, this is what happened, and it happened here, and here's how it went down. And they do it better than I ever could. I mean, those young men and women are phenomenal.
Sure.
But during that very same battle, there was the Marine, the CO of the Marine unit on board, a man named Lieutenant William Sharp Bush, was killed in action. And he became the first Marine Corps officer killed in combat at sea. And that's, not a great note in her history, but it's certainly something worth noting,
Sure.
That's where their storied history, not began necessarily, but had a definitive point in that timeline. there's the story of, after you get through the War of 1812, in the 1850s, she was sent on an around the world cruise under the command of a guy named Mad Jack Percival. And he was an interesting character. At one point, he found himself off the coast of what was called Cochin, China at the time, now known as Vietnam. And he got himself in a little fracas with the local warlord and fired some shots ashore. So the first time we ever fired into Vietnam was done by the USS Constitution back in the 1850s.
No, that's something I'd never heard. Wow. Okay.
Yeah, it's an interesting story. It's I don't recall it being in Toll's book, but it's certainly in A Most Fortunate Ship. And the story's a little bit more complex and involved in that, but that's one of the things that came out of it. And then continuing on, moving through time, she was left in a state of disrepair after she got back from that. After the Civil War was over, she was just kind of left to rot, and at one point, there was serious talk given to scrapping her, just let her go. And Oliver Wendell Holmes wrote that famous poem that galvanized the country into saving the ship. And they had to repair her and, kind of bring her back to life. There's just so many things that have happened over time, and I think what a lot of people don't really realize is that her involvement with our nation's history didn't just stop after the War of 1812 ended. She means a lot more to our nation than that. She's done so many different things, and she means so much to so many people that it's bigger than perhaps what her her famous engagements are.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that of all the Navy recruiting posters, and I've got copies of them all, is the one with the sailor holding his son's hands with the term heritage, looking at the stern of the USS Constitution. It's just a beautiful print that I've had in my office for years and years. Wherever I've moved, whatever company I've moved, I've always taken that with me because of its just what it symbolizes there to me is very deep. And it's one of those things where, I don't know, Captain, if you found the same things in your time with the Navy. But when I enlisted and then moved up in time, to me, knowing foundation of what you're serving, why you're in the Navy, what the Navy's all about, and its heritage, to me, it was always been a key part of it. And it's always been kind of hard for me to relate to those folks that joined the Navy because, well, they needed a job, or it was like, well, wait a minute, you didn't join because of what it represents. Now, when people come in, that starts to change a lot of times. But for me, it's always been kind of a sacred thing. Know your heritage. And when I finally made chief and was able to formally start to train sailors and junior officers, I made sure heritage was a big part of it because I think it's very important to understand why you're here and the foundation of this wonderful service. And it all starts with me back to not only John Paul Jones, but very quickly Old Ironsides and what that ship represents. As we always say, that folks that don't learn from history are doomed to repeat it. And I think there's a lot of great stories like the ones you were just sharing about the shore battery into Vietnam. It's like, man, there's a lot more in the weeds with this than just what she did during the War of 1812.
Yeah, there truly is. I'd have to brush up on my history to make sure I get the details right, but the general thing, the general thing is, she has been around for a long time, and it's not just the War of 1812. And I think if anyone who's listening to this can take that away and maybe look into some of the other things she's been involved with and done, I think they'll both be surprised and very pleased with her part in our country's history.
Mm. One of the one of the things that I had the honor to attend was the commissioning of the USS Bunker Hill, which was a an Aegis class cruiser, and she was the first ship built from the stern up with vertical launch systems. So a lot of them
Mhm.
were being refitted. So that this was probably late '80s or I'm guessing early '90s. My memory's gone as far as timing, but seeing this modern warship, big warship, side by side with the Constitution was pretty cool. And I'll never forget that the captain of the Constitution and his team uh, in their um, in their uniforms, their 1800s era uniforms, rowing from they were lowered from the Constitution. They rowed over to the Bunker Hill, came alongside, so to speak, and then presented the CEO of the Bunker Hill with this great certificate from the ship or whatever. I mean, none of that stuff has ever lost on me the significance of where, from old meets new, remember your history, remember your heritage, two beautiful ships, and just done in a way that, I mean, it was so classy. It would knock your socks off. And what an honor to sit there as a young sailor and watch all this go down. It was pretty neat
Yeah,
what that
it's
represents.
it's worth mentioning, since you brought it up, the 1800 era uniforms, that the crew refers to them as their 1813s. I don't know.
1813s. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know why 1813 instead of 1812s, but they're referred to as their 1813s. And those are still on the books today. They're in the official U.S. Navy uniform regulations
Mm-hmm.
for the manner and style of wear. And those young men and women there are the only people in the Navy authorized to wear them. When you go, you hand it in. You don't get to put it on anymore.
Oh, you don't.
No, no.
That's it, huh?
Obviously there's tokens and such given. I still have my my jacket and my my big hat.
Mm-hmm.
But for the I am not authorized to wear it any longer, as I'm no longer a part of the crew.
Mm-hmm.
But wearing that is a very unique privilege. One that takes a little getting used to. I mean, the first time you walk out in public, looking like that is kind of one of those moments that you suck your breath in and hope it's going to go well.
I can imagine.
But when I had my change of command, that was the first time I wore it in public, and all my friends that had come up to watch this, thought it was like the coolest thing ever, and really put me at ease. But until I got to that point, I was a little, uncertain of how this was going to be perceived and gone over. But it's a pretty cool thing to be able to wear that uniform.
Yeah. Now, when you were the captain of the ship, did you have the privilege of meeting a lot of dignitaries and folks that had come aboard? I'm just curious as to maybe some of the things that were interesting during your time as CO.
Oh yeah, so I met a few. I think one of the more interesting ones started at the very start of my tour. As you might imagine, if you know somebody of imports coming to the ship, I mean, it's usually on a schedule. So and so will be here. There's people assigned to make sure that they get, both in through the security perimeter and stuff with, the minimal amount of difficulty and things like that. Well, one day, and I think I'd been there maybe a month or so. I don't remember, but like I got the schedule, and on it said that the sheriff of Nottingham was coming to visit the ship.
Okay.
That was my reaction. I'm like, oh, come on, pull up, see how much. You see if the captain's reading the schedule or paying attention to the paperwork. And I called the petty officer and who was responsible for generating. I'm like, what is this? He says, sure, that's the official request. We got, the sheriff of Nottingham's coming. And I was starting to, I don't want to say get impatient. I'm like, come on, you're pulling my leg, right? This is a character out of Robin Hood,
Right.
Like, sir, I don't know. All I know is that we got a form, the thing filled out from the Department of the Interior, strangely enough, saying that they're bringing the sheriff of Nottingham to the ship. Like, yeah, all right. I wasn't certain enough of my position to kind of jack him up and send him on his way. So I just let it go. All right, fine. Let's see what happens at whatever time it was going to go. Supposed to go down. So I went down to the pier at about 10 minutes before the designated time with my command master chief, and